Okay, we're going to talk about historical archaeology and the history of it and where it comes from and why we do it. Because it's a little weird, right? When you think about archaeology, typically people think of really, really old stuff, and obviously history is less so, especially in the US. So, hang on, there we go. Okay. So history versus prehistory, what's the difference? You all probably know this. The difference between those is the written word. So prehistory implies no written records, and history implies written records. What's dumb or difficult or weird about these definitions is that they're very much European based. Not every culture had written word. That doesn't mean anything about them, but Western society places a high value on written records. And so if you weren't writing things down, you were somehow different. Um, so we use this as kind of this arbitrary marker in the sand for what is prehistory and what is history. Um, and in the US, this looks a little different than in other places. So in the old world, right, you have written records that go way farther back in time. Right, the old world is everything on the other side of the Atlantic. So Europe and Africa and Asia and the Mediterranean, all that good stuff. So all those places in the Middle East, right, which is like the cradle of civilization, all those places have written records that go much farther back in time. And then we get to a point where we get to classical archaeology. So, when we're looking at Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome, like there's written record there. But that's all considered classical archaeology. So that in itself is a subsection and a focus. In the US, that prehistory and history line um, comes at contact, which is much, much more recent than, Mesopotamia. So focuses on so historic archaeology in the United States focuses on European settlement, uh, on how that impacted Native Americans and how that brought in African Americans, and then frontier settlement and some urbanization, industrialization, looking at a shift from an agrarian society to an urbanized industrial society, those kinds of shifts that are happening. And that's another thing too about the whole history versus prehistory is that it's very much this colonial based division, right? To say that history started when white people showed up in the US is problematic. To say everything that comes before that point is is prehistory, right? Defining it as something before Columbus hit here, or before Columbus got here, then there wasn't anything historical about this area. Like that's a problem, right? I hope you see that. Um, so it's a weird word and it's unfortunate. But that's the accepted lingo, so we're gonna go with it. So yeah, so historical archaeology in the United States is much more recent, and answers a lot of really interesting questions about what people look like when they interact with a whole new culture, right? When white people show up and start impacting Native American cultures, what does all of that look like? As we start spreading out across the country, what does that look like? What changes can we see? And then what all of this is shown in the archaeological record. So this began recently, like the study of historical archaeology in the United States. It only started in the 1930s, so it's less than 100 years old. And it really originally focused on documentation, restoration, and interpretation. And this was very much rooted in a nationalistic idea. So in the 30s, right, as the Nazis are coming to power in Germany, all over the world, there is a focus on nationalism, on rooting your culture in history and proving your value as a group of people, as like an ethnic group almost, as being there for a long period of time and having, and that gives you power, right? And in the US, it was a much younger country compared to like England and France and Germany and things like that. So it was really looking at the early American history, the foundation of the country, right? What we did to civilize the land. Imagine air quotes around that. Um, so it's very much a field that is pursued to legitimize American identity, to make Americans feel like they have roots and that they have power and that they have um, strength in their history in comparison with countries and cultures who have been around for thousands of years. In the 1950s and the 1960s, colonial Williamsburg becomes one of the first places with a historical archaeology department. So that is right, obviously a whole town, and then specifically colonial Williamsburg is like a historic site, and so they have a historical archaeology department. They specifically study post-contact Williamsburg. And then North American universities start offering courses in the subject after they open up this department. So it only becomes a field of study at the higher education level, you know, 50, 60 years ago. But today, many universities offer majors in the subject. You can major in U.S. historical archaeology. So it's become a discipline in its own right of looking at American history. And it's also expanded in the topics that they'll discuss and that their research is interested in. They used to focus, like I said, mostly on this nationalistic idea of American roots and American founding. Um, and once we got through kind of the post-processual time in like the 90s, where we kind of started thinking more about agency and identity and started looking at you can't divorce gender, you can't divorce race from cultural systems, things like that. We started focusing more on the African American and Native American experience of the United States and what that looked like post-contact. So they're looking at the impact of European expansion. They're looking at issues of inequality. They're looking at how traditional cultures are maintained, right? Home cultures, how are those maintained?